Hello. Right, welcome to our second Rezzed session of EGX Rezzed 2019. Thank you so much for coming. This is all about gaming addiction, so which is very much a obviously interesting topic, and we have a full audience, so there's definitely people interested in it. It's going to be a form of a chat with Alice Bell here from Rock Paper Shotgun. He's going to talk with Pete Etchells, who's an academic who has covered this at some length. So they're going to have a chat on stage. We'll be able to take one or two questions right at the end. So I will come back from the microphone for that. But in the meantime, if you could give them a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, everyone. So yeah, I'm joined today by Dr. Pete Etchells, who your book is out today.
Yeah, launch day today.
Yeah, I'm doing full Graham Norton. Lost in a Good Game. And there is a lot in here that's really interesting that we won't be able to get to today. So, you know, if you're interested, there are loads of little flyers, so you don't forget the name of the book. But yeah, why don't you start by just sort of giving a little bit of background on yourself and kind of your area of expertise and why we should listen to you.
No pressure. So I'm a psychologist. I started out life doing something completely different. I was a vision psychologist, which, if anybody knows about vision psychology, is really boring. It basically involves spending most of the day getting people to look at white blobs on the screen as they went past and try and figure out how the brain interprets motion in the world around us. I played video games all my life, and I can kind of pinpoint where I started getting interested in the research about sort of 9 years ago, when I just found myself getting really frustrated with a lot of the stuff that comes out in the news about games. Around about that time, there was stuff going out in the news around things like computer games leave kids with early onset dementia and stuff like that. And it didn't sit right with what my experiences were, and I went away and had a look at the research, and there was nothing to back that up, really. So I found it kind of quite frustrating, and from there got into the whole whether violent video games make us aggressive kind of research literature, did some research on that for a few years, and started to move a little bit more towards screen time more generally at the minute, but that's sort of how I got into it, just basically getting drunk and angry down the pub one night with some of my colleagues at work. So.
That's always a good one. That's how I do all my life decisions. Yeah. So we'll start with the hottest potato, which is why I guess a lot of people have come today, which is the discussion of gaming addiction. You and some of your colleagues, I believe, were published a kind of report on why you didn't think the World Health Organization should have gone as far in adding that classification as they did, which was it 2016 or 20? It
was last year.
Oh my God.
It was June last year.
Time. It's so fast and yet so slow.
Yeah.
So what are some of the concerns that you have around the discussion?
So I think one of the major issues, so a group of us wrote a position article last year that outlined some of the concerns about why we thought this sort of formal classification was a little bit too premature, and a lot of them really coalesced around the idea that the research that we've got to back up whether or not gaming addiction is a unique disorder, and if it is, what are the unique aspects of that disorder, just isn't really there yet. So a kind of big problem with this sort of research is that when it started 20, 30 years ago, what you do is take something that you think it looks like, so maybe gambling addiction or substance use disorder, things like that. There are questionnaires and surveys that you can use to assess that. Take those and basically modify them a little bit for video games. So, you know, literally you take a gambling questionnaire and replace the word gambling with gaming. It's a really good start. It's a really good way of starting to look at that research literature. But the problem is that if you solely fixate on that, what you do is get into a point where you sort of just reconfirm everything that's already come before. So all of the criteria that you have for gambling addiction, say, will then become the criteria for video game addiction, or the same for kind of substance use disorder. So what you need to do when you do that sort of research is be really careful that you don't fall into that trap and you don't miss something that's unique to video games. And also you don't include something that is harmful in one area, say substance use disorder, but maybe isn't as harmful for video game use. And I think one of the issues that people have struggled with, researchers have struggled with in this sort of area, is this idea of excessive use, right? So a lot of the criteria for various sorts of addictive disorders will have in there somewhere that people do it to excess, or that they do it and stop doing other things instead. And that kind of makes sense when you're talking about something like heroin, say. But it doesn't sit as well, certainly in my mind, with something like video games. If you say something like one of the criteria is you start doing this thing and you stop doing all of the other hobbies in your life, well, video games are a hobby, so does that matter too much? You know, if you start watching movies less and playing video games more, is that the same sort of thing? You know, you could quite happily make the same sort of argument about golf, say. So if I start playing golf to the exclusion of all the other things that I used to do, like play video games and things like that, does it become a problem? Well, we're not really having that conversation, so that just doesn't sit well as a sort of criteria. So the problem then is that if you have the wrong sets of criteria, then you can't get the prevalence rate right. So you can't figure out how many people are affected by this thing, whatever you want to call it, gaming disorder or whatever, in the population. And then that has all sorts of other knock-on effects. So if you look at the research literature, there are estimates, if you take the gaming population, there are estimates of how many people are affected by gaming disorder that range from as high as 46% of the population down to as little as about 0.2%. Now, getting that number right is important because, let's say, some people have estimated that maybe the best way to pinpoint it is around about 3%, maybe. If that was the correct number, but we say that 46% of the population are addicted, then we're overgeneralizing and we're over-diagnosing this thing in a population which, for the vast majority of people, it's fine. And that's problematic because of things like stigmatization. It would put too much pressure on treatment services for people who haven't got a problem and don't need treatment. But you can think about it the other way as well. If the prevalence rate was 0.2%, and we think it's 3%, it might be the case that we're missing some unique aspects of those people for whom video gaming is a harmful behavior or a harmful thing to do, and they're kind of getting lost in the noise, as it were. So kind of either way, we're doing a disservice to those people. I think I should say as well that researchers on both sides of this argument, I don't think anybody is saying that there is nothing to worry about, that there's nobody out there for which video gaming is problematic. I think everybody agrees that there will be a certain group of people for whom gaming becomes a harmful thing in their lives. It's just we disagree on how to figure out who they are and what to do with them and how to help them.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting in the books that you talk about how games can be, rather than being a cause, it can be like a marker or like a symptom of something else. So, like I know, I use games as a form of escapism when there are problems I don't want to deal with in my real life, or when people have depressive or anxious episodes, they can game kind of to excess. Yeah.
I think the violent video game and aggression literature is a really good example of this. So, and we can talk about this in more detail if you want to, but when you look at that research, you look at like the introductions in the papers, everybody talks about things like the Columbine massacre or Sandy Hook, and the hook that people are taking is that there are these acts of horrendous societal violence that happen, and at some point a connection is made between somebody doing that and playing video games. So it's an important question to try and figure out the answer to. If there are people for whom, if they play these types of video games, that might be a potential outcome. We need to figure out what those games are and what aspects of those games are important and who those people are and what's going on with them. But to translate that into research into the lab is really hard. It's a really non-trivial problem to do video games research in the lab. I get flack for this all the time when I say I'm a video games researcher, and people go, right, you're a dosser then. But actually, it's one of the hardest areas in my mind of psychology to get right, because you can't stick people in a lab, give them a video game to play, and then see if they beat each other up, because ethically it's questionable. So we have these proxy measures of aggression that don't work very well. So where people have tried to move away from experimental research, and I'm going back to the point, I promise, they use longitudinal research instead. So what you try and do is follow a massive bunch of people over, say, 10, 15 years. Some of them will play video games at some point, some of them won't. Some of them will become more aggressive than others in actual kind of real world ways, and others won't. So what you try and do is trace whether there are any correlations between the people who play games and the people who become more aggressive later on. But so the point that I was trying to make was that there are other things that can impact that association. So it might be the case that, I don't know, kids who play violent video games at age 8, they become more violent and show signs of conduct disorder at age 15. So it looks as though one's causing the other, right? But there could be something else that impacts on that, something like the family environment. So if your parents don't really care what you do, it's what we call low parental monitoring. They let you out at night, they don't give you a curfew, if you say, can I have Grand Theft Auto, they just give it to you without looking at it. Then you're more likely to be in a situation, so you're more likely to be in a situation where you might play a violent video game. You're also more likely to be in a situation where you might be coerced into becoming aggressive or getting into a fight with somebody. Whereas something like high parental monitoring, where your parents don't let you out of their sight, basically, they put a curfew in place, they check everything that you do, you're much less likely to have those age-inappropriate games earlier on, and you're also much less likely to show conduct problems later on. So that causes both, but it looks like video game use is correlated with aggression. So it's those sorts of problems and similar sorts of ideas with addiction research. If you show, I think loot boxes are a really good example of this. So there was a paper that came out recently that showed that people who pay for loot boxes in games, doesn't matter how the loot boxes are implemented, there is a correlation between that kind of purchase behavior and scores on a problematic gambling scale. Not that they've got clinical forms of gambling problems, but just that they're on that sort of spectrum. Now, what the author is very careful to point out in that study is that we don't know which way the correlation is. So it could be that if you play games with loot box elements in it, it makes you more susceptible to gambling problems, or it could be that people who already have gambling problems find loot box mechanisms in games a little bit more enticing and more likely to play those games.
Yeah.
In a sense, it doesn't matter which way it is, it's a problem both ways, right? Because one way, it's causing problematic gambling behaviors. In the other way, there's an issue around whether the industry is targeting potentially vulnerable individuals.
Yeah, you do raise the kind of the loot boxes and the kind of freemium cycle that some games are moving towards as something to be concerned about, right? Because that is moving more towards the traditional measures of addiction, right? Gambling addiction. And that's not inherent to, that's not because it's a video game, it's because the game is incorporating.
Yeah, it's a really good point actually that we talk about this in a really general context about saying, you know, are video games addictive or not? Are video games, do they cause us to be violent or not, or whatever? In a sense, it's a completely pointless question to ask. It's kind of like saying, what are the effects of eating on my waistline? Well, it depends what you eat. Do you eat healthy foods, unhealthy foods? Do you exercise or not? Why are you eating unhealthy foods? All those sorts of things. So those are the interesting questions to ask, and it's the same thing with video games. It's not so much generally, are all video games bad for us or not? And it's not even, and this is a problem with the research as well, that it's quite hard to get granular data on what specific games people are actually playing. So the best sort of research that we've got at the minute limits it to the level of genres. But even then, you know, what's classed as a sports game or as a shoot 'em up and things like that can vary. But the better questions, the more interesting ones, are the ones, like you say, where we don't necessarily look at the level of a genre or mass category of games, but look at specific mechanisms that are implemented in games and see whether those have positive or negative effects. And what we're seeing at the minute is freemium style games are starting to use some of the similar mechanisms that we see that are implemented in more traditional forms of gambling, and that's a real potential worry for the future.
Let's talk a bit about some of the difficulties in conducting this research. So you mentioned it's a difficult question to ask, and so there are difficulties in measuring what addiction means, what aggression means, what video game means. So
Everything.
So, and one of the things that I liked in the book is you talk about the different ways that people are measuring aggression, for example. And my favorite one was the hot sauce.
Yes, the hot sauce paradigm.
Explain the hot sauce paradigm to her.
Yeah, so it goes back to that idea that, you know, you want to be testing things like, are people going to beat each other up more after they've played a game, but you can't do that in the lab. So we have to use these proxy measures of aggression, things that look like aggressive behavior but are more ethically manageable in the lab. And that's where it's really hard to do that. So, you know, this is no slight on people that do research in this area at all. Like, there's some really nifty ideas that come up, but, you know, the extent to which we can infer from that whether real-world violence is happening or not is shaky. So, one's called the hot source paradigm. So what you do there basically is you get people to play a violent or a non-violent game, whatever that means. Two groups of people, and then afterwards you say, okay, we're going to do a different experiment now. It's a nutrition experiment, basically. We're going to get you to make up a cup of hot sauce. Somebody else is going to come in and eat it in a bit. They don't really like hot sauce, but you're not going to meet them, so it's fine. So you're given a cup, and you're given some hot sauce to use, and you get to decide how much goes into the cup. So the idea is that you're being more aggressive. If you fill the cup up more with hotter sauce, it's sort of subversive aggression in a sense. But by far the most widely used way of assessing aggression is called the competitive reaction time task. So similar sort of setup. You have a violent and non-violent game group, and then you say to them after they play the game, okay, we're going to play another game now, and sit you in a room on your own with a computer. There's somebody else in the university somewhere else that's also at a computer, and it's a reaction time game. So at some point, a green blob, say, will come up on the screen, and you've just got to press the space bar as quickly as possible when you see that. They're doing the same thing, and if you press it first, you win. If they press it first, you lose. And critically, the person who wins gets to punish their opponent with a loud noise. So the other person doesn't exist. It's all controlled by the computer, so we can manipulate how often the person wins. You might lose a few times just to get an idea of what the noise blast sounds like, then you might start winning a little bit more. And you get to choose how loud the blast is and how long it lasts for. So there's your aggression measure. So you'll be more aggressive if you blast somebody with a louder noise for longer. And the problem with that is that aggression? Well, yeah, it's a type of aggression, I guess. But you've actually got two measures there. You've got duration and loudness. So what do you use? Do you use the mean duration? Do you use the mean loudness? Do you use the mean duration times the mean loudness? Some people do studies where they only take the data from the very first trial in the study, because that's the only time that you know that you can manipulate it so that the person wins having never lost. So you might call that unprovoked aggression, reasonably. Some studies take only the data where you win having lost the previous trial. You might call that retaliatory aggression. The trouble with it is that there's a fascinating study by some colleagues over in Germany a couple of years ago that basically took 3 data sets from one of these types of studies. The first thing that they did was that they looked at how many different ways of analysing the data there are in the research literature. And in that study, they found there's 30 papers, about 30 different ways of analysing the data. So as many ways of analysing the data as there are papers. One of the authors of that study has set up a website called flexiblemeasures.com. You can go and have a look. Has traced every single study, not just in video games research, but every single aggression study that's used this paradigm. I think it's something like 140 papers or so, something like that, and about 160 ways in which people analyse the data. So there are more ways in which people analyse the data than there are studies that use that. That's fine if you be open and honest about why you're picking that particular analysis method. But in that study, they also showed that if you take a single data set and analyse it in all 30 different ways that they showed in the research literature, you can find anything from showing that video games definitely do cause aggression to showing that they definitely don't. And that's just based on the choice that you make about how to analyse the data. It's nothing in the data set itself. So this is where some of the problems lie. I get a bit nerdy in the book and talk about all the problems with psychology generally at the minute. But it's one of these issues where again, I don't think anybody's doing this deliberately at all. I think it's just the culture that psychologists have been brought up in as researchers, where, you know, if you've got a good idea and you're convinced that X should have an effect on Y, and you analyze the data and it shows that X has no effect on Y, one of the things you might do is say, well, I analyze the data wrong. If I do it this way, maybe that works. And if you do that enough times, then you might throw up a false positive. Which is where you show an effect when actually none exists. But that's the point at which you stop. You go, there's the effect. I knew it was there. And that's the one that you report. Lots of psychologists do it. It's kind of endemic in our culture. It's problematic for all sorts of reasons. We're trying to fix that at the minute. I don't think for the most part anybody's doing it deliberately. There are these very isolated cases, not in video games research, but in psychology more generally, where people have been shown that they are doing these sorts of things deliberately, and sort of outrageous cases of fraud, and papers have been retracted as a result. But I think, generally people are just trying to find do the right thing and do the research as best they can, but there are these sort of unconscious biases about how we're brought up to do science and do data analysis that are having a real impact on what the state of the literature looks like, really.
You mentioned in the book as well that these questions about, games being harmful and addictive have been raised since basically video games. A bit like there was the first letter that someone wrote was in 1982.
Yeah, Space Invaders Obsession.
Yeah.
I love that. It's a letter that, sorry, it's just
no, you go for it.
Terrible. It's a letter of, it's 3 case studies, 3 guys who were about to get married who started becoming completely obsessed with Space Invaders to the point that it was keeping them awake at night, and they were just thinking about it all the time. And somehow the researchers kind of got to the point where they thought that what happens is that the aliens represent their bride-to-be trying to invade their home life and household, and they're playing the game to try and fend that off. And apparently everything was fine after they got married. So it was a short-lived obsession.
And then there was a study of children who started wetting the bed shortly after they got was it a NES?
Yeah, and it's a paper called Nintendo Enuresis, which is a terrible name for a new console. But enuresis is bedwetting, basically, and it's this idea that these kids got a new NES and they were playing for actually, it's something that comes up quite a lot. We saw it came out in the news last year in the context of Fortnite, that kids will play games to the point at which they will not go to the toilet and they'll wet themselves so they can carry on playing the game. And in that particular study from 1991, the author kind of quite dryly pointed out that the disorder resolved itself after a few weeks once the kids learned how to use the pause button.
But why are we still talking about it then, if we've been talking about it for 30 years?
I think it's a really good question, and the honest answer is I'm not quite sure. I think part of it is that science is really slow to do research. It's even slower to do really good, robust research. If you want to do that, it just, by its very nature, takes a long period of time. So science is sort of slow. Technology, the rate at which that develops vastly outstrips it. So we're always playing catch up in a sense. So we've always not quite got a satisfactory answer for this particular point in time. A good example of this is I published some research on the question of violent video games and aggression a few years ago. It was a longitudinal study. We found that there was a small association between playing increasingly violent video games for a given measure of violence at age 8-9, and some conduct disorder problems at age 15, but they were really small. They were quite weak associations, and the absolute risk was tiny. We looked at data from about 2,000 kids. Only about 30 of them were actually diagnosed with conduct disorder at the end. But that was based on an amazing data set called the Children of the 90s study, which it's wonderful. I can't get over to you much how brilliant this data set is. Basically, in 1990, a bunch of pregnant mums-to-be were approached in the Bristol and Avon area and said, do you want to take part in this study? And I think about 18,000 or so said yes, and they've been followed ever since. So they had their kids. They're still being followed now. So every 6 months or so, they have they come into the lab, and I think it's got one of the largest collections of hair and teeth and placentas and stuff. So you can do all these amazing kind of genetic tests. But thankfully for us, they also had some video game data at age 8-9. But that was taken in 1998, 1999. So the kind of games we were talking around back then was GoldenEye and stuff like that. So it's an interesting result, but there's a caveat, which we talk about in the paper obviously, which is that whether or not that applies to Call of Duty or Fortnite now, we don't know, because it's a different kettle of fish. So we're always kind of playing catch up. Because the research is quite ambiguous and there's this flexibility in it, there's not a concrete definitive answer either way. So there's always going to be people on either side of the debate who will say, yes, they do cause problems, and no, they don't. So it just means that it can't quite resolve itself in the public eye. And I think that it feels like it's starting to change a little bit, but I think that will carry on for a few years to come.
One of the things that we've talked about, you and I, because we chatted beforehand, is that people like to champion the good effects that games can have, like the better reaction times and things like that. But the pitfalls and the problems with the data apply equally to those as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think so you have to be obviously really careful as a scientist that you kind of check your biases at the door, and you're not saying, look, here's me being super critical of all of the negative effects of video games, but look at all the positive ways they can have an effect. Because the same problems, like you rightly say, are an issue in that research literature as well. So I'm kind of equally dubious of any sort of positive effects on things like reaction times or working memory and things like that as I am of things like aggression. I think video games do have an effect on us. I think it would be silly to say that they don't, because everything has an effect on us, right? If that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't be able to learn anything. My brain's changing right now by wittering on about this, and your brains are changing right now. That's literally how we learn. How it's changing is the interesting question, and whether it's a meaningful change is an interesting question. And I think that's where the debate lies: is how meaningful is this change, and is it the thing that we should be worried about the most, or by focusing on video games are we missing more important factors? And I think that works for both positive and negative effects.
And another thing we talked about was, like, I feel that, like, on our side, the players in the games industry, we tend to be defensive about research being done, because in a sense, someone saying we're doing research into whether games are addictive or if they make you more aggressive, that should be a neutral statement. Yeah. Right. But
in an ideal world.
In an ideal world, but we. Because we all love games, we focus on the positives and don't think about potential negatives either way. So it feels like we need to be more open to providing data and research. And
absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's a conversation that's being had more widely about screen time more generally at the minute, that the big tech companies, it would be amazing if they could open up their data on this. Even simple things like, we really don't have a clear idea of what games people are actually playing. As research scientists, what games people are actually playing on a day-to-day basis, and when they start one and start playing another one a bit further down the line. Microsoft and Sony will have that data, and games developers will have that data, and it would be nice even just to kind of get a snapshot of what people are doing, what the state of the nation is in terms of gaming. It would be amazing, really useful resource. I think it's something that I can understand where it comes from, because if you as a scientist say, look, I'm doing this research, we think, say, loot boxes are a problem, so we want to try and figure out whether actually implementing these things in games is going to cause harm to your player base. The worry, I guess, is that if the answer to that is yes, then it's not so great from an industry point of view to have funded that, because you're sort of undermining your marketing strategy. That's one way of looking at it. Certainly, the way that I would prefer to look at it is, if we move the conversation away from saying we're looking at whether video games are aggressive or not, to things like these specific mechanics. If we do find that they are actually causing real problems, then we can get rid of them, and it doesn't affect the game, right? In theory, there are other ways in which you can add elements like getting stuff like cosmetic items and stuff like that. It will have an effect on monetization, obviously.
Yeah,
so,
I was going to say EA maybe don't want to share that much data.
But like we were saying before, I think there's consequences to those sorts of decisions, right? So if you say, okay, well, we're not going to be involved in this, we're not going to make our data open to good researchers, and we're going to close everything off, and we're still going to implement these things regardless of what the science will eventually say. If the science eventually says that these things are harmful, and they're basically like gambling, the industry is going to get regulated, and that will have an impact on bottom lines. But if you want regulation, that's the way to do it, is to close off. I mean, I'm kind of painting all developers with the same brush here, and I don't need to do that at all. I talked to quite a lot of developers over the course of the book, and my feeling is that some people are really, really sensitive to these sorts of issues. They really deeply care about how their products, how their games impact their player base. Others maybe less so. But I think we have to really think hard about what we're doing here. And you know, the fundamental question is, are these things that we're doing, that we're playing, that we love and that we create, what sort of effects are they having on the people that consume them? And if we can figure that out together, if we can do it in a really open and transparent way, what we can do, hopefully, maybe I'm being naive about this, I don't know, but hopefully, you know, try and minimize the harmful effects and promote the positive effects, and that just seems to me like a win-win for everybody.
Sounds pretty good. We've got, we'll have time for some questions now. I see some hands going up already, so.
Following up perhaps on that point at the end, is it possible to distinguish between, you know, as a developer, you'd want to make a game that was engaging and involving, and the title of the book's great from that point of view, obviously. Also available on Audible, if you're too lazy to read things. But is it possible to distinguish between kind of something that makes a game engaging and people want to play, you know, and assume it's not violent and it's not gambling, and something which then perhaps becomes pernicious because you spend too much time on it in a way that is damaging to you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. So part of answering that goes back to something that's in the tagline for the book, which is about why we play games in the first place. So, and there are all sorts of reasons why people do that. Actually, again, if you look at the scientific research in that area, it's not as good as it could be. So we don't have a clear idea of that already. If we can figure out in a little bit more of a nuanced way what draws people into games, and obviously that will be different for different people. It will be different for the same people in different situations, of course. And you start kind of acknowledging that and start, you know, because it's a really complex question really quickly, right? But if we can start answering that, then we can start building that into the scientific research to figure out where there are some situations where that form of play in that circumstance might become problematic or an issue, and those are the things that we need to look out for. I think it goes back to a point that you were making earlier about whether we think of, you know, so I've played video games all my life. I've had depression and anxiety on and off since I was 18. So you could look at that and say there's a correlation between the two. Do video games cause depression, or is it the case that when I feel low, more depressed, I play games because it's a way of coping with that? And trying to figure out those sorts of questions, I think is really interesting, really important. I just don't think we're quite there yet with it.
Hi, I just want to follow up on the point you made about, you used an example of golf and playing golf to the exclusion of all other things, but we don't tend to use the word addiction for that. Addiction could perhaps sometimes be seen as a bit of a stigmatizing word. If you think about substance control disorders and gambling addiction in society, it can be quite stigmatizing. Do you think, is there a better word that could be used? Could it be perhaps be reclassified as an impulse control disorder or something like that? Yeah,
so that's one of the conversations that's happened in the literature, is whether it's best to characterize something like gaming addiction or gaming disorder. And I should point out that the WHO classification is for gaming disorder, not addiction. The DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is basically the American version of the ICD, which is a bit more international, they put something called internet gaming disorder in there a few years ago. It's very confusing why they put the word internet in there, because it covers all games. So they don't call them addictions in that sort of sense. So yeah, reterming it in some way, I think it would be quite useful. I would also say that this kind of goes both ways, though, right? So I've played freemium games on my phone where you get the next level, you've got to wait for an advert to play before you can get to that. And the number of times that I've seen an advert where somebody goes, "This game's really addictive, it's great," as a marketing technique. I think there were some gaming awards from a few years ago where there was one category which was most addictive game. Right? You're right in the sense that I think there's a lay interpretation of what addiction is, and we say I'm addicted to this thing when actually we mean I really like it and I do it a lot. I'm addicted to chocolate. You're not actually physically dependent on it, you just really like it. And that's different from what we mean in a formal kind of clinical sense. And distinguishing between those two things, I think, is really important in these conversations. So I don't know how you do that. You can't force people to change the way that they talk, but I think it's something that would be useful to do, definitely. Yeah.
That's something that like the press needs, like us, me as a games journalist should think about as well, though, because I refer to myself as mainlining games quite a lot, which obviously is a metaphor, but you know, it's tying into that whole addiction language.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Like you start kind of, if you pick up on things like that, on you know, people talking about I'm addicted to games, and you start googling what addiction is, then you'll get the clinical diagnoses and the way that we talk about it in a clinical sense. And that could be really scary if that's not actually what you mean and not what it is that you're looking for, if that makes sense. Probably wittering on a little bit. But yeah, I think the way that we talk about this, it would be nice to shift that. And it would be nice to kind of more clearly distinguish what we mean when do we mean kind of obsessive play, excessive play? Are we talking about people who are highly engaged gamers but don't have any problems associated with that, which I think is quite a significant proportion of the gaming population? You know, you can play for 10 hours a day and it won't necessarily cause any problems in your life. Other people might play for 1 hour a day, and that causes a real issue. Distinguishing between those things and the language that we use, I think is really important.
We've got time for one more question, so I think. Sorry.
Hi there. Yeah, I've got young nieces and nephews now, and you know, being a gamer myself years ago, I've been through my long sessions myself. So, are there any decent strategies that can help younger gamers? You know, I can give them advice without sounding like a killjoy, basically.
I think it's a really good question. I think it's something that I get quite a lot, particularly in the context of like screen time, where we basically have a very similar conversation but replace gaming with screens or social media. And I'm always conscious that, what I don't want people to come away with is, I sort of say this, we don't need to worry about games that much. And then some people go, okay, fine, but I'm having real arguments with my kids every night about they can't get off Fortnite, and it's really stressing me out. So you saying that shouldn't worry as much from a scientific point of view actually isn't that helpful. It's a problem because the science isn't so good. I always try and take an evidence-based approach to everything that I do because I'm a nerd. So it's hard to say, you can do this thing and the science says that that's a good thing to do. There's some emerging evidence that looks at these sorts of things and looks at things like the conversations that people have and the way that they interact with the kids can be really important. So I think sometimes a good example of this is the screen time guidelines that came out in January from the RCPCH, Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. I think a lot of people were annoyed with those because what they said was that the evidence isn't there yet to say no more than 2 hours of screen time per day or something like that. And actually, I think sometimes people are looking for things like that because if you can say, well, look, the science says this, right? So no more than 2 hours. It helps to kind of put those guidelines down. But actually, I thought those guidelines were brilliant because what they encourage was to have conversations with your kids. So try not to make them authoritarian, and there's some research again to back this up. Try not to have like authoritarian, you will not do this, or I've told you not to do this, so don't do it. But ask them why they want to play that particular game. Treat them as an equal being in that sort of sense. Explain why you feel that might not be the best thing for them to play. There are all sorts of other games that kids can play, right? So not everybody has to play Fortnite. There are other things that you can do that are equally as fun. You just need to give them a chance. And I think that's where we're in an interesting point at the minute because we're getting this generation of gamers who are parents or becoming parents who have that more nuanced picture about what different sorts of games are like and what might be appropriate for some kids and what might not be appropriate for others. So I think kind of having those sorts of conversations, just asking them, why do you want to do this? And what do you think you'll get out of it? And can you see my point of view about why I might think that that's not the right thing to do? Having those sorts of more collaborative conversations seems to kind of work more in terms of long-term not having arguments with kids and stuff. I should also say that I have this conversation quite a lot around age ratings for games. I still don't really get why we don't treat them seriously. So I talk to parents sometimes and they say, well, would you let your 10-year-old kid watch an 18 movie? And by and large the answer is no, or it might be, well, I'd see what it was and then I'd figure out whether it was appropriate and whether I'd watch it with them and things like that. Really nice, nuanced conversation about it. That doesn't seem to apply to video games for some reason. And you know, they do have age ratings and they're there for a reason, so it's useful to kind of look at those as well. So I think it's about making more informed choices and just talking to everybody in the household involved. Sorry, that probably sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but that's the best I've got.
Fix our lives, Pete.
Yeah, sorry.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's our time today. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And join me in thanking Dr. Pete Etchells.
Thank you.
Book is out today. There are loads of little flyers if you're interested in getting a copy. And stick around because there are loads of great Rezzed sessions coming up today and all week and next door as well. And hope you have a great weekend. Thanks. Bye.